Okay, here we go. Okay, welcome. As people are coming in, we'll give everyone a minute or two, or maybe even three, to get settled before we start. Thank you for spending your Monday night with us, families and friends. We're glad you're here. We're glad we could be together. Um, so settle in, give us a minute as people come into our Zoom fun, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, and while we're waiting, I'm going to turn on interpretation so that our families can listen in the language of their choice. Give me 1 minute to do that. And there we go. I'm going to add Nara. All right, everyone. And I have. Oh, we've got a little echo. I've lost language interpretation. Okay, and we will get started. Welcome, families, to a very special evening. This morning, our staff, all of our staff, were treated to a presentation similar to what you'll be seeing tonight. And I do see some staff in our attendees. So that's a testament to how great the program was, that they want to see it again. I am going to turn it over to our Executive Director for Student Services, Mary Garrity, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the week of celebration. We recognize that we have all been through so much this year. And as we return to adapted in person or continuing in goal, we need to celebrate each other and our children. This week's classroom lessons will focus on social emotional learning activities to help our students adapt to the changes within their classrooms. All of our staff heard Dr. Bolton's presentation this morning and are working to ensure that safety and health, including mental health, remains a high priority. And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Bolton. Dr. Doug Bolton is a licensed clinical psychologist who has worked with children, adolescents, couples, and families for over 25 years. As a former psychologist and principal at North Shore Academy, a K-12 therapeutic school in Highland Park, he provided intense therapeutic services to students and families and supervised the school's clinical services. Currently, in addition to his private practice, Dr. Bolton provides consultation, supervision, and professional development to parents, educators, and clinicians throughout Northern Illinois on building children's resilience, mental health issues in schools, and creating trauma-responsive school communities. Glenview School District 34 proudly presents to you Dr. Doug Bolton.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Kathy. It is delightful to be here. I love working with District 34. It's such a vibrant community, and so I'm glad to be back. And I guess the thing that I would like to say is I think it's unique and wonderful when we can have teachers and parents learning at the same time the same things and sharing as one community the same kind of information. So it's delightful to be here. Thanks so much for having me. All right, so let's get started. And the staff who are here, it's really all the same stuff, which I think is really exciting. It's organized in a little bit of a different way, but it's exciting for me that you're back as well. So when we were it was really about a year ago at this time when I was feeling really discouraged about being in the world of COVID. We had been in probably 3 weeks at this point. And I remember wishing that there was somebody I could talk to that has been through this, so that I could find my way through it. And I realized there was somebody. She's not around anymore, but it was my grandmother. She was born in 1899. And as I thought about her life, I realized what a remarkable childhood she had. She lived right outside of New York City, where she grew up. And when she was 7, there was a typhoid fever outbreak. And then when she was 15, World War I broke out, and we lost over 100,000 soldiers. And 2 years after that was a polio outbreak. And how frightening that must have been for kids and parents. And then we've all heard about the Spanish flu that came in 1918, all before she was 19 years old, these things happened. But then when the Spanish flu ended, right, the Roaring Twenties came. Isn't this a great picture of her? I thought this was like a stock photo. And then I realized, no, this is the photo my brother sent of my grandmother. I love this photo. And she lived it up in the 1920s. She met and married my grandfather, Walt. And they had my father, their only child, in February of 1929. But we know what happens after that, don't we? Just a few months later, the stock market crashes and we're plunged into the Great Depression. And after that came World War II. We lost 405,000 soldiers. Life had completely changed. And then, as if that wasn't enough, my grandmother experienced her own personal tragedy, which is the loss of her husband, Walt, to a heart attack. The amazing thing is that my grandmother, even though she had been through all of these things, when my parents were divorced, she was the one who was the backbone of our family. She was the one who kept us all together. I never would have guessed that she had dealt with all of that stress early in her childhood. So she took a great role in caring for us. She had a real way with kids, didn't she? I love this picture. She actually was really good with us, but I couldn't resist putting this picture in. But what do we call her generation, right? This is a generation of people who lived through polio, through a pandemic, 2 world wars, and a depression. What do we call that generation? We call it the greatest generation, don't we? And so it made me wonder, what makes us resilient? Because I'd love to help us figure out how I can be more resilient and how we can help our kids be more resilient, and how can we cultivate resilience in our kids? And finally, is it possible that we can not just cope during this time, but that we can thrive? The 3 themes I want to hit on tonight are, how do we manage our own stress? Because there's no way that we can help our kids manage their stress without effectively managing our own. The second is, how do we take care of our children? And then finally, can we think differently about this time? So COVID is novel. None of us have dealt with this before, have we? None of us have been through a pandemic before. So it's new to everyone. And some of the things that make it unique are that there's a constant stress. We are constantly at risk of either acquiring the virus, transmitting the virus. People are at economic risk throughout this time. There's an intensity to this. So many people have died. So many people have gotten sick. So many people have lost their jobs. And then there's the other intensity, which is all of our lives got turned upside down. Very few stresses impact us with this level of intensity. It's enduring. Did anyone else? I remember March 13th, they said we've got to shut everything down until April 7th. We're coming up on April 7th, a year from April 7th, and we're still in a realm of shutdown. Our lives are still different. This is enduring in a way that is unique. And finally, it's global. This impacts everybody on the globe. David Brooks said, if coronavirus is the earthquake, then our racial and social and political upheaval that followed is the hurricane. And the thing is, we all have our own relationship to all of these stories, but they're all deeply distressing to all of us. It's really an extraordinary time with extraordinary stress, but I also think there's extraordinary opportunity. All right, how do we understand and cope with this stress? The interesting thing is that stress, and I think this is pretty well known by now, is what stress does is it pushes us into the more primitive parts of our brain. We're not as good thinkers under stress. It triggers our fight, flight, and freeze response, doesn't it? And what this does, it's really our stress response is really part of our autonomic nervous system, which is a very, very primitive system for how we respond to threats. There are really only two directions that our autonomic nervous system goes in. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers our stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze. And then there's the parasympathetic side, and that returns us to homeostasis, which brings us back to being a regulated and calm self. But it's either or. You can't be on both at the same time. It's like being on a train. You can't be on two tracks at the same time. One is on when the other is off. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to be our response to a real and immediate threat. That's what fear is. Fear is how we respond to threats that are right there in our face. Every multi-celled organism has a system like this. Every multi-celled organism has a stress response to be able to fight and for our survival, and then go back to homeostasis. It's nothing special about the human brain. But what is special about the human brain is, on top of this very primitive two-pronged system, evolution placed this remarkable prefrontal cortex that's very, very complex. And from that, it gave us this thing called anxiety. So if fear is our response to a real and immediate threat, anxiety is our response to thoughts about potential threats. And this is a very important distinction, because one of the things that it does is it allows us to be time travelers, right? It allows us to think into the future. What's going to happen to my children, given that they've been doing remote learning so much? What's going to happen to their social skills? What's going to happen to them academically? What's going to happen to my parents who've been in a nursing home? What's going to happen for my job? All of these things are things that we can think about and worry about. That cortex allows us to do that. And we're also mind readers. We're wondering what other people are thinking and feeling. We worry about how our kids are experiencing this. We wonder, are the teachers okay? Are the teachers happy with how my child is doing? Right? We're constantly wondering what other people are thinking and feeling. And the problem is, we're doing these things all the time, aren't we? But we're really bad at both. The problem is, our body responds as if these beliefs are true. Our body responds as if these things are actually happening. And so with coronavirus, there are so many different things to be stressed about. Typically, we've got our lives figured out, and then things stress us. Someone cuts us off in traffic and our stress response goes up. And then maybe we yell something that's not very polite, and they drive off, and we drive off, and then we come down back to normal, right? That's how it's supposed to work. The problem with COVID, when there are stresses that are so constant and so intense, is that our stress response system never gets a break. So why do we have this anxiety? The wonderful thing about anxiety is it's out there to protect us. What it does is it tells us all the things out there. There's a minefield of things that could go wrong in our lives. And it's out there to tell us, look at all the things that could go wrong so we can avoid those things. The problem is anxiety is often wrong. A lot of these things that anxiety tells us are landmines don't exist. They aren't really landmines. Anybody else have their smoke detector right outside of their kitchen? My smoke detector has gone off dozens of times. Every time I burn something, and I burn things a lot in the kitchen, that smoke detector goes off. And the thing is, that's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? It's not supposed to be right every time. It's supposed to just let us know when there's a possibility that our house could be on fire. My house has never been on fire. This thing goes off all the time. This is the way our anxiety works. And it's important for us to understand that. And it's not that these thoughts are irrational. They aren't, but they're also not true. If I worry about my daughter because she's coming home late one night, later than expected, and I worry about all these things that may have happened to her, doesn't mean that they're irrational. It just means that they're not true, though, right? Because she's always come home and she's always been okay. But what happens is our stress response is constantly getting triggered. And when that happens, when we go into that lower part of our brain, we lose these tools that are so important for basic problem solving, because when we're in fight or flight, it's not helpful when we're being chased by a grizzly bear to be a good listener. It's not helpful for us to have empathy. I don't want to say, oh, I hope I'm going to hit this grizzly bear with this big old stick, but I hope it doesn't hurt it. That doesn't help, right? What ends up happening is we shut down the parts of our brain that aren't helpful in a real physical emergency. Listening and creativity and flexibility and empathy all go out the window. Has anybody else noticed that their memory isn't as good? My memory has gotten real bad this last year. Language, sometimes it's harder for us to find the words, or sometimes those words that we find are really 4-letter words, right? These are things that happen when we are stressed. Part of it's because we struggle to inhibit, we are more impulsive. These are things that happen to all of our brains, the teachers' brains, our kids' brains. We've all been in this place more in this last year than ever. I feel like this is what my brain looks like this year, right? It's just felt like I've been a dumber Homer Simpson. And as a result of this, we don't feel like we're the same parents or the same friends. We don't show up to our colleagues and spouses in the same way. And a lot of people have said, and this has been true for me, my energy has been much lower. It's harder for me to focus at different points in time. And the things that really sustain us, this motivation and optimism, those have been fading for me more than they ever have. And other people have said the same. And so what we need to do is we need to manually override the autonomic nervous system. We need to switch the train tracks to say, okay, because it doesn't happen on its own, we've got to be more intentional about triggering our homeostasis, because we spend so much time in our stress response. So how do we do that? Well, the top 3 really are diet, sleep, and exercise. This is not a time where you got to lose 15 pounds. This is not it. But what we're talking about is figuring out how can you make sure that the food that you bring into your bodies are going to be healthy and sustaining, and that we don't go through the ups and downs of the sugar highs that we can often have when we're eating poorly. I often say that diet is a battle we fight in the grocery store. Once it gets into our kitchen, at least for me, it's a lost cause. Sleep, I've struggled to sleep, and for some reason in the last week, it's been even harder. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to keep our sleep routines consistent, because if we fall, or if we let our kids fall into bad sleep routines, then when we get through this, it's going to be harder for them to sleep well. And then exercise. Again, we don't need to run a marathon, but it is essential. Getting outside and getting movement is really what we're talking about. I read a study that said it's amazing the impact of just 3 minutes of movement outside, the restorative impact of that. Imagine if we take a half hour to do that. Hobbies are really important. Some people have had to let go of their hobbies. But what hobbies do is they help us to focus on the here and now and in this moment. And what a gift that is, to be able to be productive on this sweater that I'm knitting, or on this woodworking project, on this crossword puzzle, on this scrapbook, whatever it is, right? That's our work, is to figure out how can we get lost in this. Maybe it's a jigsaw puzzle you're doing with the family, but engaging in those hobbies that are important to us are more important now than ever. You know, routines are interesting. One of the things that's been so stressful about this time is not being able to predict when this is all going to be done. And we can have a lot of anxiety not being able to predict what's going to happen with COVID. The interesting thing is that if we can predict what happens in the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes, if we can get our kids and ourselves into routines, then we don't have the same anxiety about what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes. And for that time, when we're not focusing on what's unpredictable about COVID, but we can focus on, oh, this is what my day looks like. This is when we have dinner. This is what our morning routine is. That's really important. Your teachers are going to be working on that in the next 2 weeks because all the routines in school are going to have been thrown off. And so this is job number one, is make sure everybody knows what's coming next and how to navigate all these routines, because it's really stressful not knowing what's coming. You know, connection is really important. And during this time, especially through the winter, we've lost touch with a lot of people. At least that's what I've heard, and certainly that's been true for me. Being intentional about reconnecting is so very important. We all have our own regulation strategies, our own routines that are helpful for us. Don't let go of those. For me, it's going down to the beach. I live in Evanston, and I go down to the beach in Evanston. And when it's nice out, I'll sit and I'll read non-work related books. And I went down there this morning. This is from this morning. It's beautiful, isn't it? And I could have spent the time and said, oh my gosh, I've got 2 presentations today. I should go practice those some more. And maybe this presentation would have been a little bit smoother if I had practiced those a few more times and not gone to the beach today. But what I will say is that I believe that going to the beach helps me be more present right now. And hopefully that'll help me show up differently for this presentation. Mindfulness and breathing, this is relatively new to all of us, although in Eastern life, they've been focusing on this since the beginning of time. But mindfulness, what it does is in our focus on the here and now and in this moment, it quiets that time traveler and it quiets that mind reader. And in this moment, we can realize we're okay. Breathing is really interesting because when we're stressed, we hold our breath in and we breathe in a much more shallow way. But when we exhale, what do? We breathe a sigh of relief. And the interesting thing about that to me is that the autonomic nervous system has nerve endings on our lungs. And when we exhale, it indicates to the rest of our body that we must be safe. And so just breathing can help us reduce anxiety. We can do it through all these other practices, but breathing is very effective in doing that as well. And there are easy apps for both of these. And they don't take much time. It can be 5 minutes a day. And when things get stressful, it can be just checking in on a mindfulness activity or just checking in on some breathing. The other thing that the research on gratitude is really powerful. And the study I like the most is the one where they had people write 3 things they were grateful for in a journal every night before they went to bed. It took about 10 minutes. And it's not grateful, like these huge things we're grateful for. I'm grateful for a loving family. I'm grateful to have a job. I'm grateful for, I'm grateful for the fact that vaccines are coming, whatever it may be. What it is gratitude for discrete events from that moment, from that day. So it could be, I'm so grateful that my child's teacher reached out and let me know how they're doing. I'm grateful that my spouse brought me a cup of tea this morning when they could see that I was frazzled and didn't have time to do it. I'm grateful that my kids were laughing when they were cleaning up instead of arguing like they usually do. These discrete moments of gratitude. They did it just for 1 week. 21 items of gratitude written in a journal, and then they left them alone for 6 months. And when they came back in 6 months, the people who'd done the gratitude journal continued to show lower levels of anxiety and depression. And the same is true for mindfulness and breathing, that these effect sizes are similar to anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications. These are powerful tools that we can use to be able to ground ourselves. And they only take a few minutes a day. This could be around the dinner table, having a moment of gratitude, whatever that looks like. Speaking of medication, would you take a pill that creates a misperception of risk, increases anxiety and learned helplessness and feelings of contempt and hostility, and decreases your moods? Most people would not take that pill, but most of us are. This is what the research suggests happens when we watch the news. There's so much disturbing stuff on the news. I like Lester Holt, don't get me wrong. It's not Lester. We all have to be informed during this time. This isn't about cutting it out, but it is about recognizing that when we are watching disturbing stories, It's triggering our stress response system. And sometimes I will go looking for those stories. I didn't realize this until I saw this, the definition of doom scrolling. I'm a doom scroller. I am drawn like a moth towards light to the most disturbing stories out there. I will get on my news, on my social media feeds, and I'll say, I'm just going to look for a couple minutes, and I am lost in the most disturbing articles, and it's hard for me to pull myself away. Social media is also a really important way for us to stay connected. But what we want to do is we want to curate where are the places we're getting our information from, or how much time are we spending on these sites. These are the things we need to recognize. What happens in our bodies and in our moods after we've spent time drawn to these disturbing things, these upsetting things. And then finally, as I was really, I think that last spring, COVID was really hard for me from a career perspective. It was hard for me emotionally. I felt cut off from people. And I had time on my hands. And so as I started studying, how do people manage these down times in their lives, the same theme kept coming up. And it's a theme that I'm going to call impermanence. And the impermanence is the idea that our lives go up and down constantly. There are times in our lives and times during COVID that I feel like, okay, I've got this. Everything's going to be okay. This is not a problem. And the thing is, I've got this belief that once I've got this figured out, it's going to stay smooth and I'm going to stay on top of that wave forever. But that never happens, does it? Whether it's COVID or not, if I'm feeling great, I should know by now that it's only a matter of time before things are going to get hard for me again. I'm going to feel crushed by the weight of whatever stress is coming, whether it be parenting stresses with my teenage kids, whether it be job stresses, whatever it may be. But then the opposite is also true, isn't it? That as hard as things are, I've always come back out of them. And sometimes it can take hours, sometimes it can take days or weeks. But at the end of the day, our lives are this constant cycle of ups and downs. And so what I've learned is that when things are hard, I just need to know I need to wait. I need to take care of myself in the ways we've talked about, but I also just need to wait and things will get better. And when things are good, not to expect that there's some karmic problem that's good, that somehow has taken my legs out from under me. No, this is what happens in life. And it happens not just in my life, this happens historically, doesn't it? A pandemic and a world war led to the Roaring 20s. And then there was a depression and another world war, and then the Greatest Generation and a decade of amazing prosperity in the US in the 1950s and 1960s. And so this is just how the world works. And once I was able to realize that, it becomes needing to surf the waves. And I can predict that things are going to get hard, even when things are going well. And I can also predict when things are hard, that they're going to get better for me and for my kids. So the key thing is to be intentional. If there are things that you're already doing, make sure you don't drop these things. And I would say, if there are things, most of these things don't take very long. Even the exercise doesn't take long. We just need to get outside and move several times a day. Can we engage in some of these and have some of these in our back pocket for when things get hard? So take a look at the list. What have you let go of that you want to put back in? What's something that you'll try? All right. How do we take care of our kids? One of the things that we know is that we're in lower brain and our kids are in lower brain. And believe it or not, their teachers are in lower brain. And everybody is trying to do everything in a whole different way. And that puts us even further into lower brain. You're trying to be a parent while also doing remote work from home. You're trying to help your kids learn. Your kids are going back, thank goodness, but then there's going to be a whole nother level of stresses for them, and so we're all limited. This is not a time when I believe that we're going to, go through the roof with test scores. It's just not the time that that's going to happen because we're all limited. So the question is, how will they cope with this? but also where's the opportunity? If they're not going to be able to hit the same test scores that they may have otherwise, I think there's an opportunity that is unique in this time. And that is, it's the opportunity to build resilience. Because the thing about resilience is you can't build resilience without stress. And our kids are experiencing stress right now. And the flip side of that is that they are also learning how to be resilient. And you're experiencing stress and they're watching you be resilient. And one of the things that worries me as a former principal and worries me as a parent and worries me as a psychologist is that the last 2 generations of kids, we have seen an uptick in mental illness with our kids. And we've seen our kids become less and less resilient. And I believe that if we can handle COVID well, and as we're handling this time well, our kids are going to be stronger than they've ever been. And they're going to be more resilient to the mental health issues that they've had to struggle with in the generation up until now. So how do we do this? G.W. Winnicott, he was an amazing psychotherapist. He was a pediatrician. And at the time, this is back in the 1940s, all of the theories of parenting were saying, you need to parent in exactly these ways, or else your child will be a failure. And what D.W. Winnicott said, he said, no, we don't need to be perfect. We just need to be good enough. Back in the day, it was good enough mother, but this is good enough father, good enough coach, good enough uncle, good enough teacher, right? He went on to say that babies and children actually benefit when their mothers or fathers or teachers fail them in manageable ways. This is so interesting to me, that it's in our failure that our children need to, that is how they learn how to be more resilient. I told this story this morning. My daughter studied, she's a senior. She studied for a full year every day religiously to study for the SAT. And she had her morning set out perfectly that morning about exactly what needed to happen. And she said, I need the car at 7:30. So I said, all right. And she knew that I'd be at the beach. So I came back from the beach. I dropped the car off at 7:28. Thought I was in good shape. She left. I wished her luck. She's back in 4 minutes. And she says, Dad, there's no gas in the car. I said, well, what do you want to do? And she said, I guess I'll stop. It threw her whole morning off. The most important morning for her in that year. And I completely threw her morning off. And I felt terrible about it. So don't get me wrong. This feels terrible. And yet what she learned was that she could cope with unexpected things, didn't she? And what she learned was she got there. She had to wait in line anyways. She said it wasn't that big a deal. Maybe she lost 3 or 4 SAT points. But what I will say is I'll bet that she gained a lot more in being able to realize that even when things don't go her way, they're okay. When we lose our temper with our kids, it gives us the opportunity to model for them how to make it right. When we forget to pick them up at practice, they learn how to cope in those moments. These are essential moments. But the problem is, I think that this generation of parents, we are terrible. Our inner critic goes crazy because we feel like we've got to be perfect for our kids. There's something that is said in our generation that if our kids are experiencing distress, then we've got to fix that. And I think that's a problem. We need to be able to tolerate our kids' distress, because by tolerating their distress, they then learn how to tolerate their own distress. And that's resilience, isn't it? We don't need to be perfect. Our goal is just to survive this storm, and it's going to be ugly, and it has been ugly. Our clothes are going to be wet and wrinkled. Our hair is going to be a mess. But if we, at the end of this, are standing on that pier, holding hands with our kids and our neighbors and our friends and our kids' teachers, that's going to be the lesson that they learn. Brene Brown said, sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is just show up. And so how do we do this as parents? Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson wrote a book. I really like this book. I don't think it's beautifully written, but I love the concepts in it. And it's quick. It's a quick read. And what they talk about is how parental presence shapes who our kids become and how their brains get wired. Not how parental perfection does it. It's how our presence helps them rewire their brains. And how we do that, showing up for them, involves helping them feel safe and seen and soothed and secure. So safety is about protecting them from harm. And we've been protecting them from physical harm for this whole year. We've never been more focused on their physical safety than we have this year, right? But there's also a different kind of safety. And this is a picture of my mom with me and my little sister. And if this was really something we needed to be worried about, she would have picked us up and we would have taken us to safety. But what she's doing is she's helping us feel safe in that moment. This is about psychological safety. Can our kids feel safe from shame? Can they feel safe from our anger? Can we avoid becoming the source of fear for our kids? The mistake we make, and I'm not sure if anybody else has made this mistake, but I've made this mistake a lot. I've lost my temper with my kids more in this last year than I think I have in any other year. And what I've heard is that other parents have experienced the same thing. We are all stressed. We're going to lose our temper with our kids. And I guess I want to say, it's okay. Again, we don't need to be perfect. But when we're doing this, what we need to realize is I need to take care of myself, because if this is spilling out at my kids or my spouse, I need to take responsibility and care for myself in these ways, so I'm less likely to lose my temper. But we also need to forgive ourselves, don't we? And then we need to make it right. And the beautiful thing is that when we can forgive ourselves and make it right with our kids and make it right with our spouses, we're showing our kids how to make it right when they lose their temper and when they lose their cool. They're watching us, aren't they? Showing up is also about helping kids feel seen. And feeling seen is being attuned to their feelings and being curious. They experience coronavirus, this pandemic, through very different eyes. Can we be curious to see this through their eyes? One of the interesting things is that this desire to be attuned to our kids is hardwired into us. And it's an essential piece in parenting younger kids. For those of you who have infants now, you may notice that when they make a face, we mimic that face, don't we? And what's happening is they're experiencing something. And they make an expression and we mimic it. They get to see, this is what I'm feeling based on what they see in our faces. And it happens all the time, doesn't it? Some people take it too far, right? But here's the thing, as kids get older, it looks like this, doesn't it? Just being attuned, trying to understand, what is it that you're feeling? And helping them understand that their feelings are real. We may not have the same feelings, but their feelings are real and their feelings are fleeting just like ours are, even more fleeting than ours are. But the mistakes we make is that we try and fix their feelings for them. We try and take away their distress. And in doing so, we don't help them learn how to deal with their own distress, or we minimize it. Why would you think that? Or we shame them, that's ridiculous. Or your 2-year-old brother's behaving in a more mature way than you are. There are ways that we shame in these moments, and each of these things is problematic. So what do we do when our kids start to fall apart, when they're experiencing big emotions? What we want to do in those moments is we want to soothe them, and soothing is all about returning them to homeostasis, isn't it? But you need to soothe yourself first. I like this quote: when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. Who else, when our kids are dysregulated, becomes really dysregulated? And then if they're yelling, I start yelling. That's me. I still do that, and I know better, right? It's hard not to, but when I can take care of myself and really be calm in the face of their distress and not feel like I need to fix it, not feel like I need to make it go away, but just to sit with them, to hold space with them. I like this picture because this child is clearly in distress. The mom is just being present, right? And then can we help them soothe themselves? With younger kids, it may be teddy bears or Legos. And with older kids, it may be listening to music, walking the dogs, taking a walk with a friend, right? These are the ways that we soothe ourselves. But the mistake we make is that we punish instead of soothe. And I love this picture because it's so powerful to me. This boy is experiencing so much shame, head down, facing the wall. I could see myself saying, "You're being disrespectful. Go take a time out," right? And they go and take that time out. But I guess what I want to say is, why don't you just spend time with Charlie, the dog, right? This dog is his regulation strategy. What I wish I would say is, why don't you and Charlie go up to your room, and when you're calm, and I'll calm myself down too, then let's figure this out, because neither of us is in a place to work this out right now. We need to give it time. And what we also need to understand is that this is developmental. They'll get better at this over time as well. But everything works better if we give it a little bit of time, doesn't it? And then finally, when we've created a home environment that feels safe, where our kids feel seen and soothed, and they're able to soothe themselves or allow us to soothe them, that gives them a sense of security with which they can then go out and face the world. I love this quote. It was on a bathroom wall, but I had to take a picture of it. You have within you right now everything you need to deal with whatever the world can throw at you. And that's what this security does, is it allows us to realize no matter how bad things are, I'm going to be safe. My feelings are going to be seen. I'm going to know how to soothe myself. This is what resilience is all about. And our kids have been through everything, haven't they? Our kids, the world has thrown everything at our kids. And for the most part, they're holding up better than we ever would have imagined. But in order to do this, we need to take care of ourselves, don't we? We need to take care of ourselves first. And I know I'm beating a dead horse, but this is how we do it. And we need to realize that good enough is good enough. For our kids, good enough is good enough. For us as parents, good enough is good enough. For their teachers, good enough is good enough. That's all that we need to do in this time. And there's beauty in imperfection. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because when we fall short, when we fail our kids in manageable ways, they grow and they become stronger. But we need to forgive ourselves when we fail them. We need to model saying that we're sorry. I love this quote by James Baldwin. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. Your kids are watching you. They're watching your teachers. They've watched you this whole time. And they are learning resilience by watching you be resilient. They're learning to make things right by watching you make things right. And if you've struggled with that up until now, they're going to learn the lesson from here on out, aren't they? I also like this quote from Nenea Hoffman. Note to self, all you have to do is show up, be late, be scared, be a mess, be weird, be confused. Just be there. You'll figure out the rest as you go. All right, how can we think differently about this time? How can we think differently about resilience? Tom Boyce did this remarkable research. He followed kids from preschool all the way into college, and they took samples of their saliva to measure their stress levels. They watched them at home, they observed them in school, and they were able to determine which kids were stressed and how did they deal with that stress. And what he found is that there are two different kinds of kids. He said there are dandelions and there are orchids. The amazing thing about dandelions is that they can grow up anywhere in between the cracks of concrete. They can withstand any storm and any temperature. We know that from our yard. Mine can withstand my lawnmower. It's amazing what they can withstand. Orchids are very different kinds of plants. They're much more sensitive to their environment. They need the right amount of water. They need the right amount of light. They can't tolerate great changes in temperature. But the amazing thing about them is how beautiful they can become when in the right setting. And what he found is that 80% of kids are orchid kids. And I'm not saying this is easy for them, but 80% of the kids are managing this pretty darn well. And this is what teachers will tell you, and this is what parents have said, is it's not great. Nobody would ask for this again, but overall, kids are doing okay. They've adapted. Resilience, it turns out, is the norm and not the exception, is the norm, not the exception. But he said 20% of our kids are orchids. And those are the kids that we need to be that are more sensitive to their environment. So we need to do everything we can to be able to help them navigate their environment. One of the things that's interesting is in every classroom, there are kids who perform better in remote learning. And what that means is there's things about the stresses of school that are particularly hard for those kids. Let's understand that and let's figure out what are the stresses of school for them. One of the things we do as parents is that we often assume what's going on. They're just being lazy. The teachers aren't doing enough, whatever it may be. The question is, can we ask? The one thing I've learned being a psychologist, being a principal, and the one thing that I wish I was better at, especially when my kids were younger, is being curious. I make so many assumptions about when my kids are struggling, about why they're struggling, and then I try and fix it for them. It's amazing what happens. Can we be curious? Can we ask them what's happening? Can we be patient and see if we can help them find the words? And then let's partner with them to figure out how we can solve this problem. This is how we help the orchids. Can we think differently about connection? One of the things that's been so hard about this time is kids have not spent time with other kids, and adults have not spent time with our friends either. But here's the thing, what have we spent a lot of time? Who have we spent a lot of time with? Each other. What a remarkable time for families this is. One of the things that happens is kids, the more time they spend with peers, they're picking up their values from their peers. One of the blessings of this time is they've spent more time with us. They've watched you work from home. They've seen things in your life that they never would have seen before, and you've watched them as students. There is the connection that we've had with our kids has been very different. One of the things that happened in our family is we started doing family dinners. My kids and I've got a private practice. I'm working through dinner most of the time. All of a sudden we had 4 months of dinners, and that became the cherished time for us. We got to know each other better than we ever had. And while I didn't have as many friendships that I could engage in, my kids were staying at home the whole time. There was a richness to this time. And during this time, can we tell our stories about COVID? Can we talk about our own heartbreak with our kids? Can we talk about our victories during this time, how we've adapted, how we've coped, how we've fallen short? The interesting thing is that humans think in stories, and we try and make sense of the world by telling stories. When we tell these stories to each other, we create family narratives that then help our kids understand this time and put it into context. Even when we don't understand it ourselves, we understand it better through the eyes of our kids when we're telling our stories and when we're listening to theirs. So often, we just want them to tell their stories, and we don't want to tell them our stories. Here's a tricky one. Can we think differently about achievement? This is not a time when our kids are going to be at their highest level of achievement. Can we think about this time as a time of building resilience, though? I was talking to a superintendent, and I said, you know, when they were bombing London in World War II, they closed schools down. Kids didn't go to school for about 2 years. And I don't remember anybody saying, wow, those Londoners, that was a dumb generation of Londoners. Look at, they've completely failed. Nobody was successful. No one said that. What they, and you know, the interesting thing is that this superintendent said, you know, my father grew up in London in World War II. And he didn't go to school for 2 years. And I said, well, what happened to him? And she said, well, he ended up going to the University of Rochester and getting his PhD. And I would add that his daughter is a superintendent of a high-performing school on the North Shore of Chicago. Things worked out okay. The bottom line is kids' brains don't just all of a sudden open up when they walk into the classroom and close when they leave the classroom. Your kids are learning. They're picking things up all the time. This is our opportunity. But here's the thing. One of the things that happens is we have so many expectations for our kids. We treat our kids in ways we would never treat ourselves. And especially you're going to find this as your kids, and some of you may have kids in high school. Who would ever tolerate their spouse waking up early, rushing off to an early class, leaving the house at 6:45 or 7, doing a full day of work, and then joining their basketball team for practices in the evening, right? And then or joining their band for practice every evening for 2 hours, coming home, getting a quick bite to eat, and then going back to work for 3 hours. Would you say, honey, don't you have some work to do? What happens when our kids say they don't have homework? We say, what? You don't have homework? You don't have things to do? Right? And yet this is what we do with our kids. If they don't have something to do after school, there's something wrong. One of the things that happened in my private practice when there was only remote learning last spring, is parents said, it's really hard, this remote learning. But we love the fact that there's no homework at night. We aren't battling with our kids at night, right? So can we think differently about homework? My daughter is in a statistics class at Evanston Township High School. And every year they do this thing where they learn how to do statistics by doing a survey of how much sleep kids, the students get. And so every student in the high school fills these forms out and they figure out how much sleep. Guess what? Kids this year, during remote learning, we're getting an hour more sleep than kids any other year. And you know what the interesting thing about an hour more of sleep is? An hour more of sleep improves our mood. An hour more of sleep improves our academic achievement. An hour more of sleep improves our health outcomes. It's amazing what an hour of sleep will do. If sleep dips below 8 hours, the risk for depression doubles. And yet, we're watching our kids stay up late at night to get homework done, especially our high school kids. So in some ways, I'm prepping you to try and think differently about when your kids go to high school. Our overscheduling has an impact, doesn't it? The other thing that's happened is we've been able to partner with teachers in a whole different way, haven't we? You got to see into teachers' homes and they got to see into your homes. You are partners in your child's learning in new ways. What a gift that's been for everybody. It's been hard, don't get me wrong, but you know more about your child's teacher. And my hope is that that partnership can continue in the years to come after COVID's over, that we can feel a partnership between home and school in a way that we haven't before. Can we think differently about the finish line? One of the things that's really hard, this is not a marathon, because a marathon, we know when it's going to end, don't we? The challenge at this time is we don't know when it's going to end. That's really stressful. So we don't know how hard we have to run or how much we need to save. There's a story that I read about a dog musher. And what she said is, my dogs never know how long the race is going to be. And if I went and started a race, they would just run for as long as they could. They'd run for maybe 40 or 50 miles, and then they would drop exhausted. She said, but some of these races are hundreds of miles. The Iditarod is over 1,000 miles. And so she said, what we do is we stop every 4 hours and we rest and we eat and we get warm. And then we race for another 4 hours. Nobody wants to stop after the first 4 hours. Everybody wants to keep running, but it's so essential. And what she said is, how long will this pandemic last? Right now, that's irrelevant. What matters is eating a nourishing meal, telling someone you love them, walking your dog, getting enough sleep. What matters is that to the degree you can, make your own life sustainable every day. That's our work, isn't it? Even though there's a lot of hopeful signs, vaccines are coming, numbers are dropping. We don't know. We still don't know what it's going to look like next year in school. We don't know what our work is going to look like. This is going to still last for us, hopefully not in the same intensity. But it's so important that we make our lives sustainable every day. And then finally, can we think differently about stress? We talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, but there's something called post-traumatic growth. People who experience adversity often see positive growth afterwards and a rise to an even higher level of functioning than before. A traumatic event, it turns out, is not simply a hardship to be overcome. Instead, it's transformative. It becomes a dividing line in people's lives. And I think COVID is going to be a dividing line in our lives in so many ways. Here's what the research says, is that post-traumatic growth, people who've experienced trauma often have an increased sense of inner strength afterwards. They have an openness to new possibilities in life. I've got an openness to winter outdoor gatherings around a fire, right? I'm open to things in ways. I'm hoping that there are COVID evenings in the future where we still sit around a fire outside in the winter, even if COVID's gone. Closer and often deeper relationships with families and friends, and enhanced appreciation for life. Who isn't going to appreciate walking into a restaurant with a group of 10 of your best friends not wearing masks and being able to stand close to one another? We're going to appreciate that in a way we never realized. And finally, a stronger sense of spirituality. And the thing is, even though we talk a lot more about post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic growth is actually more common than post-traumatic stress. Resilience is learned. And I like this quote by Eileen Zimmerman: "You can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be learned. Part of the skill building comes from exposure to very difficult," and notice the language, difficult but manageable experiences. It's the same language that Winnicott used, isn't it? We were talking about the same things 100 years ago. Resilience helps us be. The stress helps us be more resilient. I want to be careful. I want to introduce you to the term of tragic optimism, which is the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain and loss and suffering. This is not to say that there hasn't been great suffering. I don't mean to minimize that at all. But what I do want to say is we need to be able to hold both truths, that this is very, very hard. It's been very challenging, and yet some of the most beautiful things come out of the times that are most challenging for us. Both are true. I want to talk about the flip side of coronavirus. Coronavirus came in and completely turned our world upside down, didn't it? And yet, opportunity often comes disguised in the form of misfortune or temporary defeat. And there hasn't been a year in my life when I've felt the throes of misfortune and when I felt more defeated than at different points in time this year. But the thing is, we cannot helicopter parent our kids out of this stress, can we? There's so many different ways we try and protect them from stress. We haven't been able to protect them from this. We cannot snowplow this stress out of their way. They are having to deal with this stress. And when we rebuild, after this is all done, we need to be thoughtful about what we've learned. And what do we keep? My thing is, I've got to keep family dinners. Those are important. It's going to make it, there's going to be a sacrifice in my private practice. But I realize that's something I want to keep, and I can let go of those things. What is it that you've learned that you want to keep from this time? Maybe it's your kids sleeping longer. Maybe it's playing games at night with them. Maybe it's sitting around the fire pit in winter. Whatever it is, what do we keep and what do we let go? It's important that we're intentional about this, because we can fall back into those old patterns very, very quickly. And when we pull back the curtain on this coronavirus, I believe that our kids are going to be more independent, more resilient, and more community focused. And why is that? Because there's never been a year when we've asked kids to be more independent, when we've asked them to be more resilient. And the only way we've gotten through this is as a community. And when our kids walk in and they're wearing our masks and they're socially distancing, they are contributing to a healthy community in school. And they're watching you do the same thing. And this is what's going to happen if we do this well. 10 years from now, what will our children remember? I don't think they're going to say, oh, my lesson in fractions was not as robust as it normally would have been if I had been in person learning, so I didn't get into Purdue's engineering school. I don't think they're going to say that because, number one, that's not true. But number two, what they're going to realize and remember from this time is how they adapted. And they're going to notice and remember how you adapted, how you changed everything about your lives and your family's lives to make this work. And they're going to watch how their teachers completely changed how they taught within 10 days so that kids could learn remotely. They're going to remember how they adapted. And that's going to be a lesson that they will take with them, not just the rest of this year. They're going to take it with them into high school and college and into their work and into their families and into old age. This is their lesson. 2 world wars, a pandemic, and a depression led to the greatest generation. I believe this is going to be a similar generation of kids that are more resilient, much like my grandmother was. And they're going to be supports for all of us as they get older and become leaders in our world. Ernest Hemingway said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are strong at the broken places." I believe that we're all stronger because of this. And I'm not saying that, and that strength comes out of these moments of profound weakness and fear, that we recognize our strength. Last March, coronavirus came in. We were writing the stories of our lives, and for most of us, those lives were wonderful stories. And the problem is, coronavirus came in and they took the pen and paper out of our hands, and coronavirus wrote the story for us. They wrote this last chapter. But we get to write the next chapter. And I'm excited to see what we write. All right, this is my information. If I can be helpful in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. We've got wonderful people at Formative Psychological Services in Northbrook and in Chicago. But if there's any way that I can be helpful or answer any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I'd be delighted to stay as long as you guys have questions and in any way that I can be helpful tonight.
And we will start out with a couple of questions. First of all, Doug, that was wonderful. I am so lucky to have been able to hear you twice today and learn from you. We are thankful that you are supporting our community. The first question we have is, are you seeing any psychological issues in young children, our youngest learners, 4 to 6 year olds, due to COVID? And what signs would we see if they are struggling or distressed?
Yeah, I think that there's at every age we're seeing kids struggle. And I guess what I would say is the struggle is a very natural struggle. I can't think of an adult who hasn't struggled during this time. I do think that there is if you're beginning to see some signs of depression, if their appetite is shifting, if their sleep is really changing in ways that are distressing, if they're expressing things, if they're not as interested in things that they're normally interested in, those are times that you might want to seek out an evaluation. But this is also a place where schools can be really helpful, and talking to teachers and seeing if they're seeing that. I wouldn't be surprised for some kids going back to school will take that right away. And for other kids, going back to school will become more anxious for them. And so being able to watch and observe your child, knowing that everybody is struggling in their own way during this time. The struggle itself is not, I think, cause for alarm. But if it becomes prolonged, or if there's things that seem that trigger some level of distress in you, getting an outside evaluation, getting an evaluation through school, partnering with school is really important, because the other people that really see your child are your child's teacher. And so they are a wonderful resource of information on how your child is coping.
And I'm glad you said that, Doug. We do have virtual office hours at all of our buildings with our school social workers and psychologists, and we've sent that information out. And it's also available, I'll drop it in the chat before we leave, on our Be Well 34 page for families, where we have resources for families. We have Be Well 34 for students, resources
Great.
that parents can use and that our teachers use in their classrooms. So I'll drop that in the chat while you're answering the next question.
Let me just add one more thing onto that, which I thought was interesting. It came up in another parent talk that I gave, and that is when we've got these worries about some kids are struggling with social skills in ways that they weren't pre-pandemic. And I guess what I want to share is that they haven't had as much practice, and they may be more anxious. They may struggle more in those moments. And so it's just important to not say, oh my gosh, now they've got a social anxiety disorder. All of us are going to struggle at some level in getting back into the work. My guess is that teachers are going to be more anxious walking into the building and figuring out, oh my gosh, how do we navigate this? And so I guess what I would say is we can give those things time. Development works is an amazing thing, and development does take time. And I think that allowing development to take its course is important. So if your child is struggling, maybe they need a little bit more practice being outside once everybody feels safe with that. But just because they're struggling now doesn't mean that this is a clinical level of struggle. It may just mean that they need more practice.
A parent asks, my child's confidence has dropped significantly this past year. What can I say to comments like, I didn't do well on that test, or I'm so dumb?
Yeah, this is another place where a couple of things. One is, how do we model things? So how much as parents do we talk about the things that we've failed at, the times that we've blown a meeting, the times that someone at work was angry with us, a time when we got a bad performance review? If we aren't able to talk about these things, but we're asking our kids to talk about them, I think it's important that we model these discussions. The other thing that I would say is there's wonderful research by Carol Dweck, and the teachers know this really, really well, called the growth mindset. And the idea is being able to understand that when we see setbacks as opportunities for learning, as opposed to indications that we're not capable, then all of a sudden we can be much more resilient. And so the work is to be able to say, yeah, it looks like this was a tough, you had a tough time with that test. Let's be curious and see, why was this test harder? And I wonder what we could do next time so that you can feel better about it, about how you do on this. What can we learn from this? Instead of saying, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, you clearly didn't try hard enough, or you need to study more. What we want to be able to do is help kids be curious about why they struggled more. Partner with them about that, and then hopefully help them know that it is through our failures that we learn more than anything. So let's be curious about why that happened. And Carol Dweck has a book, but my guess is that that your teachers will be well versed in growth mindset. Am I right about that? Folks, so I think that that's the other piece is Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. It's kind of a dry book. Look her up on the internet. You can get enough just from that growth mindset, Carol Dweck.
Great. If we have any more questions, you can throw those out there. We do. My child has lost connections to friends this past year. They feel sad and that there is something wrong with them. How do I react?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things I would think about for that. The first, I think, is to normalize what they're experiencing. I certainly have felt that way. that when we don't have these connections, what it does, there's an evolutionary pull for us to be connected to other people. And that's a whole nother parent talk if you'll have me back. But when we're disconnected to other people, what ends up happening is there really is a very primitive kind of anxiety that takes over for us, because we are a tribal species, and being left out means that we are at risk. If from an evolutionary perspective, we only survived because we were able to be with other people. And so feeling isolated from other people is triggers for many of us a real sense of anxiety. And so I think that the thing that I would do is I would do a little bit of coaching if there's ways of connecting remotely. If there are, my hope is that as kids are going back and spending more time in school, that those relationships will be fostered again. I would also be sure that asking your child's teacher, if they're going back to in-person learning, asking your child's teacher to keep an eye out and just see how they're doing socially. If they're seeing that they're struggling socially, then there may be some things at a school level that can spark some of that. If there are ways that you could slowly introduce through play dates, if there's a way to be able to do that, that could be important as well.
A question about school refusal for a high schooler.
Yeah. This is tricky, and not knowing, there's so many, at North Shore Academy, we did a lot of work with kids who were school refusing. There's always a story behind why they're refusing. And I think this is an interesting time, because it could be that they're afraid of the virus. It could be because they just love remote learning. It could be, there's a lot of reasons. And so not knowing the reasons behind that, what I would say is that I would again be curious to figure out, and they might say, I just hate school. But can we stick with that conversation and say, what is it about school that's so hard for you? Is it harder now than it was before COVID? At some level, I think that there's a strangeness to school right now that can be unnerving for kids. And my daughter has the opportunity now at Evanston to go remote or not go into hybrid learning. And I'm giving her that choice. There's a part of me that would say that if your daughter has a choice now, I would probably give that choice, because going into school isn't the same way it was before. But then I would say, let's figure out if this is going to be an issue moving forward. If this is going to be an issue next year, then I do think that there's a different level of urgency, and working with the school to understand what the school can do to support you. Potentially working with outside folks to be able to help you navigate that really tricky time. The thing that we don't want to do, I guess, the real challenge about school refusal is if for some kids, it's just reasonable avoidance. I don't want to go back to school because everybody's just on their computers anyways, and there's only 3 kids per class, and it's weird, and I'm in a groove and I'm doing well, so I don't really want to go back yet. That's a different school refusal than a real avoidance. And avoidance can take, the thing that I would worry about is this a symptom of other ways of coping, which is avoiding things that are uncomfortable? And if this is what's happening, if there's an avoidance issue of things that are uncomfortable, then I would say that might be a good time to begin to looking at first of all, being curious and seeing if you can partner with them to solve it yourself, and then getting some extra help. Because we don't want, kids' lives can get very, very small if their main coping strategy is avoidance.
A question about screen time. Remote learning opened the door and shows kids that they can be on a screen for long periods of time or need to be on a screen for long periods
Yeah,
of time.
yeah.
What are your recommendations to roll that back?
So I think that we've all been we're on screens now, right? So this is the case for all of us. The thing that my rule of thumb as parents is if we want our kids to roll their screen time back, the most important thing is for us to roll our screen time back. And we may not be doing video games downstairs, but if we are constantly checking our Facebook or Instagram feeds, and if every free moment our face is looking at our hand, then I think we need to, that to me is the challenge. If we're asking our kids to be off technology, we need to be off technology. And my hope is what ends up happening is that there's engagement between parents and kids and with siblings. So that would be the first piece is really monitoring the adult. I'm terrible at this, by the way. And, it's like asking my child to get off technology and then, there I am checking my email all night. So I think that we need to be really thoughtful about this ourselves. I think that I don't have any hard or fast rules about screen time. What I do know is that we've all used screens because we've needed to, and we spent more time on screens, and that screen time can be exhausting in a very different kind of way on our brains. And so I don't have a certain amount of minutes or hours that kids should spend on screen time. But what I would say is that making sure that that there are limits that everybody can feel comfortable with around screen time, that those are done as collaboratively with kids as we can, and that we hold true to those for ourselves and for our kids, so that not only are kids not on their screens, but we aren't on our screens, and then maybe we're seeing each other in a different way because of that.
Another question, my 8th grader is worried about other kids not taking COVID precautions seriously as she goes back to school. How do I reassure her about what she can't control, but what she's afraid of?
Yeah. You know, the there's a level of trust in adults that we all need to have. We trust schools for a lot of things, and so um, I'm not sure if we can convince her of this. I think it's generally a good thing when kids are more cautious. I worry more about the kids who are less cautious about their own precautions and how that may spread. So she'll be a great community member when she goes to school. I do think that saying that this is what the school has worked very, very hard at navigating this, and that they've got structures in place to be able to deal with exactly this. And if there are places that you feel uncomfortable with this, it may be on a bus, it may be walking to school, then let's troubleshoot those together. Where are the places you're most worried? Once kids get into the building, I'm convinced, I'm not saying that a kid's mask will never slip down, and I'm not saying that that everybody's going to wash their hands in the way that we expect them, that we might hope that they would. Kids are kids. But I would say that I will guarantee you that District 34 has never been more focused on any other initiative more than keeping kids safe from COVID in school. That this has been the work. And if we've kept kids out for this long, then this district must feel comfortable with the structures they've got in place for kids to return. So that's more, Kathy, for you and Mary and Sarah to talk about. But that's, I guess, that I'm not sure if that's helpful for your conversation with your daughter. But I do think I would see where are the places you're most worried, and then we can talk about those. And maybe there's a call or an email to a teacher to say, just want to let you know that that my daughter's really anxious about lunch. And can we, or they're anxious about the bus ride, or they're anxious about PE and what that'll look like. So just want to give you a heads up that might be hard. Can you talk to her when she comes in and just let her know what the plan is for those things?
All right, I think that is all the questions we have. Mary Garrity, would you like to say anything in conclusion? Families will be hearing from us a little bit more throughout the week about our celebration and things that will be happening when kids are back in school. And this was kind of the kickoff for parents. So, Mary?
Thank you all who came tonight, and thank you, Doug. Your partnership is so much appreciated. I was also, like Kathy, very pleased to be able to hear the presentation again. I learn something every time. We're also going to be highlighting this week at our Board of Ed meeting on Monday. Please talk to your child about the different activities that they have going on in the classroom. Dr. Sarah Gebhardt has put together some wonderful activities, and all the buildings, social works and school psychs have also. Our goal to that last question is really to focus on helping kids reduce that anxiety and understand how resilient they really are and how proud we are of all of them. So there was another question or no?
That was
Right.
a
that was
kudos.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So with that, I bid you good night. I think the Gonzaga Baylor game is starting now.
All right,
Thank you.
everyone, you know where to find me if you have further questions. Have a wonderful night, a wonderful week, and be well.
Thanks so much.
Be well. Thanks, Doug.